Hello everyone! In this video, we'll be covering phrasal verbs. First, we need to know what they are, and we need to keep in mind that phrasal verbs are not unique to English. Here we have two examples, one in English and another one in Portuguese. Phrasal verbs are usually called two-word verbs, and that's because they are the combination of a verb and a preposition, which is called a particle. In the first example, we can see that up only shows the movement of the verb, so we cannot call it a particle, and this verbal combination is not a phrasal verb. In the second example, up changes the meaning of the verb to mass, then we can call it a phrasal verb. Sometimes the phrasal verbs are combined with prepositions, now being called three-word verbs, just like put up with, in which we have a verb, a particle, and a preposition. Then we have cut down on with the same three parts. Knowing what they are, we need to know why they exist. First, we use them to avoid unnecessarily long sentences, just like the phrasal verb to check out. The second reason to use them is to avoid less common verbs. And the third reason, and probably the most important one, is to avoid verbs that come from Latin.
There are two types of phrasal verbs, separable and inseparable. It means that sometimes we can separate a particle from the verb in a phrasal verb sentence and put a direct object in the middle. This separation is something we can only do with transitive phrasal verbs. Intransitive phrasal verbs, the ones with no direct object, cannot be separable. Transitive verbs can be separable or not. When the direct object is the specific name of a thing or a person, it can be located after the phrasal verb or in the middle. So it's possible to choose, in these cases, to separate it or not. The separation is always obligatory when the direct object is a pronoun. So the sentence needs the particle and verb separated and the pronoun in the middle. Some transitive verbs are inseparable. In these cases, the direct object must be after the phrasal verb.
Phrasal verbs can be considered highly productive, which results in an extensive lexical category. They are not exactly intuitive, since there is no way of knowing beforehand what particle combines with what verb. Also, there is the matter of unpredictability of the meaning. That means that the meaning of the whole phrasal verb can't be discovered by the singular meaning of the parts. For example, someone might know what run and out means individually, but not necessarily know what it means to run out, to have nothing left. So, how is it possible to understand phrasal verbs? One way of learning phrasal verbs is by memorizing, but that is not as effective as it should be. Other way of learning is to find a logic and systematicity in its representation. The first step is to divide phrasal verbs into three semantic categories: literal, spectral, and idiomatic. Literal phrasal verbs appears to be a combination of verb plus a directional preposition, but function syntactically as a verb and a particle since the particle contains the prepositional meaning. In that sense, meaning is clear and can be considered compositional. Examples: sit down, throw away. But when it comes to spectral phrasal verbs, the meaning is not as clear as the literal ones. However, we can say that the particles have a consistency in their meanings. For example, the particle around have consistency in meaning activities without a sense of purpose. Example, to goof around, to mess around. As opposed to literal phrasal verbs, the third category, idiomatical phrasal verbs, have no indication of meaning by the individual parts. Still, understanding the logic behind the construction can lead to comprehension. For example, run up the bill. Run indicates movement and up indicates higher direction. When combined, they give us a sense of something increasing. In that case, the amount of money is increasing. Another example is, I need to muster up enough to watch the horror movie. If we assume that the context is that horror movies requires courage, to muster up will be a synonym of gather up. Analyzing component in specific context is the key word to understand idiomatic phrasal verbs. Despite the extensive lexical production, as stated before, some logic can fortunately be found.
How to teach phrasal verbs. Teaching suggestions. Many teachers like to begin to introduce the concept of phrasal verbs using total physical response. Giving commands such as stand up, sit down, turn on, turn off, turn up, turn down, and so forth You get students used to the fact that certain verbs in English are composed of two forms, and the exercise will have students begin to associate meaning with certain common forms. Teaching phrasal verbs with games. Prepare 20 verb cards and 20 particle cards for each small group of students. The students shuffle the verb cards and place them face down on a desk or table. Then, they should do the same for the particle cards. The first student in each group turns over one verb card and one particle card. If there is a phrasal verb match, the student should give a sentence using the phrasal verb to show that a student knows its meaning. If there is no match, the student should say that. Teaching phrasal verbs by topics. If a class is learning about relationship, you can add a manageable set of phrasal verbs that will help them express ideas related to relationship. When we teach phrasal verbs in this way, we are not focusing on the phrasal verb itself. We are focusing on the idea that it expresses, and therefore it's natural to apply it. There's a good way to practice the literal and spectral meaning of certain particles. The teacher makes a grid with 5 verbs along the side and 5 particles along the top. Students have to make up sentences for every phrasal verb combination possible. Then, they should see if they can figure out the underlying literal or spectral meaning of the particles. Don't forget, the students must understand the phrasal verbs are more informal and are used more often in spoken rather than written English, although may be used in informal written communication like emails to family or friends.